Good evening from Jerusalem to all participants in this exclusive briefing brought to you by the Miskav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. I'm David Weinberg, a senior fellow at the Miskav Institute, and I'm your host for this evening. We'll be focusing this evening on the question, what can the international community do to help defeat Hamas? Two people are with me this evening, two outstanding fellows and experts. We'll begin with my colleague, Miskav Institute Senior Fellow, Mr. Asher Friedman. Mr. Friedman previously served in senior roles in Israel's Strategic Affairs Ministry, as well as serving as Chief of Staff and Diplomatic Advisor to Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs and Public Security. He also serves as Director for Israel at the Abraham Accords Peace Institute. He holds a BA and an MA from Harvard University in Government and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm not so sure that Asher is proud of his alma mater at this moment. Mr. Friedman will be talking to us, as I said, about steps the international community should take to help defeat Hamas and how you can help. Following Mr. Friedman's briefing, we'll be joined by Professor Eugene Kantorovich, who will focus on the civilian suffering in the current Israel-Hamas conflict and how the laws of war apply and don't apply to that. Professor Kantorovich is a professor at George Mason's Anton Scalia School of Law and director of its Center for International Law in the Middle East. He's also the head of the International Law Department at the Kohelet Policy Forum in Jerusalem. This briefing, again, is brought to you by the Miskav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy, a Jerusalem-based think tank, a new think tank, headed by Meir Ben Shabbat, who was National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister and Chief of the Israel Security Agency's Southern Command. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers after our two briefings this evening. You can post your questions in the chat function here, and I will direct the questions to Mr. Friedman and Professor Kantorovich after their briefings. We have about an hour for this call. So without further ado, Asher Friedman.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you very much, David, for that introduction. Good evening, good afternoon, everybody who's joining us. We've all been shocked by the massacre on October 7th, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And in response, we've seen an outpouring of support for Israel from the international community, from celebrities, from businesses, from philanthropists, and from ordinary people across the world. And a lot of people are asking, what can I do? What can I do? And certainly the support for Israel, the support for our soldiers who are on the front lines, the support for aid organizations, first responders is incredibly important, as is solidarity. What I want to discuss at the same time, or in parallel, we've seen a tremendous amount of activity from many organizations, individuals, groupings of people who are being very active to support Israel in its goal of defeating Hamas, and of course, to work towards the freeing of the hostages, of the babies, the children, the elderly, the women, the men that we know are being held by Hamas and by other Palestinian factions in Gaza at this very minute. What I'd like to do this evening is to go through at just the level of headlines, because each one of these topics could be divided, could be detailed to much greater detail, about what are various steps the international community can take, again, beyond military support, which is a separate ist, and beyond statements of solidarity, which are good, but you have to translate them into concrete steps. And most even of what I'm going to discuss are initiatives that are being undertaken as we speak, as I said, by many excellent pro-Israel organizations. And what I've done is essentially collect quite a few of them. I'm going to present them here, discuss perhaps how they can be expanded, the rationale behind them, and a few others of my own. First of all, when we talk about international pressure on Hamas and international pressure on its funders and supporters, particularly countries like Qatar, Turkey, and additional countries as well, Malaysia, Algeria, Kuwait. Why do we think that would work? Well, the answer is because we're seeing that the outrage and the disgust over Hamas's barbaric attack is leading Hamas to try to do a little bit of PR, a little bit of damage control, whether it was releasing that video of the young woman who has French citizenship yesterday, that sort of not fake video, but the video they claimed to show a woman being released from after the attack, which really happened at the time of the attack, and a few laughable interviews that we've seen by Hamas representatives on Al Jazeera and other television stations, and not so laughable Hamas propaganda videos, which we see are being, claiming that the images are fake and there's no evidence and it's all AI, which we see already are being parroted online. So we see that Hamas is susceptible to pressure. We know, for example, that Qatar is susceptible to pressure because it is right now embroiled in a scandal, Qatar Gate, in the EU, because it was revealed that it was paying bribes essentially. It's been claimed that they were paying bribes to various officials in order to improve their image following the criticism of their human rights image around the World Cup. We know that Turkey, for example, there are a number of issues, things that it wants, for example, from the United States, that it is very, very, very strongly desires, and therefore could also be susceptible to pressure. We saw just a few days ago, Algeria and the United States had their strategic dialogue and reaffirmed their strong bond. And again, here too, while Israel obviously has not a lot of leverage points on Algeria or on Malaysia, other countries, so the United States, but the European countries, other countries in the West, and not only in the West, who are allies of Israel or who are part of the group of Western nations who have condemned Hamas, all have the ability to bring pressure to bear. Now, when we talk about what we want, what the goal is, obviously the first goal is to have all of the hostages released immediately. There are, I would say, lesser demands which can be made, whether it is releasing the women and the children and the elderly, those needing medical attention, allowing the ICRC without delay full access to all of the hostages. The goal here is to act from numerous different angles, both to put pressure, again, on the issue of hostages and to take advantage of the clarity that's been gained by the international community as to the true nature of Hamas, as to the Hamas is ISIS, Hamas is worse than ISIS, to further dismantle, further fight back against Hamas's infrastructure, whether that's financial, political, moral, around the world. So let's dive in. Now, Qatar, as you may know, is defined as a major American non-NATO ally. They've also provided about $1.5 billion to Hamas over the last decade. I believe in 2021, they provided $360 million to Hamas. I think it's about $120 million annually. They've been hosting Hamas's headquarters, or one of Hamas's headquarters, since at least 2012. We know that Al Jazeera has been one of the main cheerleaders of Hamas, has been very supportive in promoting their incitement. Qatar is a complicated issue. On the one hand, it is a clear supporter of Hamas, a funder of Hamas, an enabler of Hamas. On the other hand, it is host to we can't ignore the fact that it's host to major US military bases. It is a major supplier of energy to the world, certainly following the Ukraine-Russian war. And it has, as mentioned, extensive economic ties with Europe, with the US, with additional countries. But at this moment, I think we're at a moment again where moral clarity is needed. And when the country that is financing ISIS, financing modern day Nazis, I think that's a fair description, we can no longer look away and say, the different considerations. this is a clear case where the international community must put pressure on Qatar and say to Qatar, make a choice. Make a choice. Are you going to be part of the enlightened community, the community that's on the side of civilization? Or are you going to continue funding perhaps the most barbaric terror organization that we see right at the current time? And there are a whole host of tools, levers that could be used related to economic sanctions or the non-expansion of economic relations, could be potentially related to the military cooperation between the countries. We also have to remember that all of these countries, especially in the Gulf, but not only, are sensitive to their public image in terms of inviting high-profile economic and celebrity actors and sports stars to come to their countries to events, in sponsoring and being sponsors of major sporting events, major cultural events, and significant investors in educational institutions in the West. And here too, there is certainly room, in the case of Qatar, in the case of other countries as well, to ask people who are appalled and aghast by what Hamas has done to make it clear that they, as individuals, as corporations, as celebrities, as sports figures, as the academic institutions, will no longer turn a blind eye to the fact that Qatar is funding this terror. Turkey as well. Turkey is not just hosting Hamas leaders. Turkey went so far as to give passports to Ismail Haniyeh, to Salah al-Aruri, to Ismail Haniyeh's son. In 2018, Erdogan told Prime Minister Netanyahu, we do not consider Hamas a terrorist organization. Hamas isn't a terrorist organization, it's a resistance organization. There have been reports of Israel intercepting explosive materials coming from Turkey, not necessarily obviously from the Turkish government, but coming from Turkey. Here too, Turkey is a NATO ally. NATO countries have overwhelmingly defined Hamas as a terrorist organization. And here too, there should be a clear demand to Turkey and to, like I said, to Algeria, to Malaysia, to all these other countries, Kuwait, where Western countries have influence, that Hamas offices must be shut down, and they must use the full weight of their influence, their leverage over Hamas in order to demand that Hamas release these women, children, and elderly, and all of the hostages that they are currently holding. Now, we saw, moving on, many countries have defined Hamas as a terror organization, not all, and we've seen some movement over the last week and a half. Countries like Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, countries that in the past resisted defining Hamas as a terrorist organization, and now are sort of taking the first steps, making declarations, setting up committees. Obviously, pressure needs to be put on to ensure that. I want to raise a possibility. There'll be some that say it's not realistic. I think it is potentially realistic, which is India. India, we've seen an outpouring of support for Israel, an outpouring of criticism, obviously Prime Minister Modi, who has been an incredible friend of Israel. India also has the most to lose, or one of the countries that has quite a lot to lose from the fact that Hamas, whenever it wants, can start up regional conflicts and can undermine the processes of regional normalization and cooperation. Remember, India is part of the I2U2 forum with the US, UAE, Israel, and India, part of the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which was recently announced at the G20 summit. India has a tremendous amount to gain from this process of cooperation across the Middle East that will connect east to west and allow the entire region to become a hub of trade, of transport, of energy, of innovation. So the India too, I think there's potential for taking more concrete steps than we've seen in the past against Hamas. Now, we saw a number of countries, Austria, Germany, Italy, Denmark, and Sweden, announced that they were going to be reevaluating their funding of the development aid for the Palestinians. We saw the German chancellor declare that there'll be zero tolerance for support for Hamas. And the question is, how do you, we've seen Germany and France open up investigations, criminal investigations against Hamas for murdering and kidnapping their citizens. And remember, we have citizens from over 40 countries who were murdered or kidnapped in the terror attack. first of all, the investigations should be expanded to every country that has this kind of apparatus, these kind of legal basis for opening such an investigation. Again, not because Hamas particularly cares, not because Hamas is worried that not because Ismail Haniyeh is worried that he's going to be brought before a French judge, but because, again, this continues the pressure, it continues the international statement that Hamas is ISIS, Hamas is beyond the pale. The next question is with regards to opposing potential funding to Hamas, to opposing support for Hamas. How do we translate that into action? One way, there are a number of ways to translate that into action. First of all, it's clear that almost all funding that goes to the Gaza Strip ends up benefiting Hamas. We know, for example, that many of UNRWA's employees in Gaza are Hamas activists. The previous Secretary General of UNRWA admitted that probably many of them are, and it's not a problem. I can't do anything about it, and I'm not going to check. We know, and this is actually something that's on Israel's plate, that much of the Qatari funds are going to Hamas operatives or members rather than to needy Gazan families. And obviously, Israel is going to change its approach going forward. We know that there are a number of funds, charities, NGOs operating in Europe, some of which have been designated by the Israeli Defense Ministry as part of Hamas's financing network. Organizations like Islamic Relief, Muslim Hands, Human Appeal International, that the Israeli Ministry of Defense has said these are part of Hamas's funding network. European countries have, in some cases have closed them down, in some cases have not closed them down because they claim the evidence is insufficient, political reasons, whatever. Now is the time to take the steps. And that's true as well with various NGOs, the PRC in the UK, PGT in Germany, EUPAC in Brussels, and many others that people who have been involved in this space know well, that have clear ties to Hamas, that have senior members who are former and probably current activists of Hamas. And now is the time to, again, one step is to outlaw them, but there are other steps, whether it's putting barriers on financial transactions. In the past, we've seen various financial platforms put restrictions on the use of their platforms by NGOs connected to the PFLP terror organization. Certainly the same should be true for any organization connected to Hamas. The loss of charitable status, certain organization that is actively promoting a barbaric terror organization, again, ISIS and worse than ISIS, should not be enjoying charitable status, and that's another avenue for action. I would also suggest that all parliaments, all Congress, all governments that have various human rights committees, human rights bodies, as an example, the Lantos Human Rights Commission in the US Congress, hold hearings on the hostages being held by Hamas, on Hamas's massacre that we saw in October, again, to highlight Hamas's atrocities, to put pressure on any who support Hamas, to put pressure, as I mentioned, on private public sector actors that are in any way obviously having dealings with Hamas, but also involved in countries that are financially supporting Hamas. And again, another way to highlight Hamas's atrocities and the plight of the hostages. Staying for a minute on NGOs or international bodies, we have a number that could be doing much more. The ICRC only a few days ago came out with a statement. We should have seen them from the first minute, demanding access to the hostages. International, obviously they're hostages, these aren't prisoners of war, but international law is clear regarding how prisoners of war should be treated, that those suffering from medical conditions need to be transferred, either released or transferred to a hospital in a neutral country. Another example of an organization is UNICEF, the UN Children's Organization, which after a lot of pressure put out one statement, mentioning the Israeli children, but then right away went back to focusing primarily on the children being, sadly, tragically being used in Gaza as human shields for Hamas. We need to be seeing much more action related to the children being held by Hamas. And of course, recall that among the countries that today do not designate Hamas as a terror organization is the UN Security Council. As we recall, in 2018, the United States and the Security Council tabled a resolution asking to define Hamas as a terror organization, and only one country, only the United States, supported the resolution. Every other country, including European countries, abstained, and there were also a few countries that voted against such a resolution. So yes, at the Security Council, are we going to see a veto by Russia and China and some of the other members if such a resignation is once again tabled? Almost certainly yes. Nevertheless, it's time for all the countries, all the major powers in the world to show clearly where they stand. There are a number of other steps that countries can take and should be taking. I want to also, obviously, we've seen a number of admirable steps by philanthropists related to the reaction of universities when universities, who are so quick to condemn, jump on other bandwagon issues, put out, fail to condemn or put out ridiculously neutral statements on the attack. And I think that's going to have an impact. And obviously that should be encouraged and continued as well. I would also like to argue, certainly I am, this is again, a little bit of a different direction. But before we go there, the other issue, and this is obviously something that has been raised by other organizations, Hamas doesn't exist in a vacuum. Hamas was voted into power by the Palestinians in 2006. In almost all the polling that exists, we see strong support for armed resistance, quote unquote, by the Palestinians, especially in Gaza. We see that in any elections that might be held, Hamas figures like Hania against PA, against Abu Mazen, against Mahmoud Abbas, Hania would win by a large landslide. Now, the argument is not that Gazan civilians should be treated like Hamas, although again, we know that many Gazan civilians took part. I mean, in a sense, Hamas perhaps from the first times, crowdsourced this terror attack, right? We saw hundreds of civilians from Gaza, civilians crossing into Israel and taking part. We've seen videos of taking part in looting. I have spoken to people who were there from the IDF and other branches, also taking part in the kidnapping and murder of Israelis. But again, the argument here is not that Gazan civilians should be treated like Hamas. The argument here is that there needs to be much deeper processes, essentially, to be blunt, processes similar to the denazification processes that we saw following World War II, in order to create the potential for peace and bring that to a practical level. Again, the potential for a future lasting and viable peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And to bring that to a practical level, one of the issues, obviously, is the issue of the education system, the school textbooks, but not only the school textbooks, also many other educational materials, summer camps, children's TV shows, cultural events, sports tournaments, in both the West Bank and in Gaza that encourage, incite to terrorism. And insofar as any Western funding is going to these kinds of things, it obviously needs to be stopped. And as well, we have what I would call the attempts by many of the organizations that act as middlemen, you could call them, between Hamas and the West. So numerous Palestinian NGOs that have been working in overdrive since the horrific attacks to explain why this is justified resistance, why the Palestinians are within their legitimate rights, why Israel should be blamed. Now, again, this is work done by NGO Monitor. Many of these organizations are funded by European governments, by the EU, by various foundations. There's been very strong resistance in the past to putting down a red line, saying these kinds of statements are unacceptable, this kind of support for terror is unacceptable. Now is the time to say, again, look, Hamas is ISIS. We've seen, if never again means anything, it has to be put into action now. And this is the time to cut off funding, not only any kind of funding that might get to Hamas, but also to organizations that are looking to legitimize what Hamas is doing and to essentially whitewash, and by doing that, to also set the stage for continued such attacks. The last thing I want to mention at this stage, and I know obviously I'm happy also to hear questions or following Professor Kantorovich. This is a totally different angle, but also one that I think is important. I have had the privilege of being very involved in the Abraham Accords since their signing in 2020. And Muslim Jewish dialogue has been led by various different organizations and religious leaders over the last many years. Some of it very successful, some of it very important. Now, I'm certainly no scholar of Islam, of Muslim law, and there are many people who are greater scholars than I, but from my research, and I've done a fair amount of research, while there are some sources that might be construed or that are construed or misconstrued by terrorist groups to support this, there are many sources in Islam, in the Hadith, in the practices of the rightfully guided caliphs, which make clear that what Hamas has done goes against the very core of Islam. And when we look at the greater picture, what's been happening since the Abraham Accords? On the one hand, we have processes of moderation, of the growth of tolerance, of dialogue, of mutual understanding in the region. And we've seen that very clearly with the Abraham Accords countries, but also with other countries in the region. And on the other hand, you have Iran, you have Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, which will obviously have a very different vision, and a different vision not only for regional power, but also for Islam and for the ability of religions to work together. And here I think there needs to be a lot of work being done together by all those involved in interfaith dialogue and in Jewish, Muslim, Jewish Arab relations, to have people of authority from the Islamic world make clear that what Hamas did is not only is barbaric, is terrorism, and goes against the core values and principles of Islam. There have been a few voices to that effect, but I believe that they should be much far greater and far wider. Again, I'm certainly no expert, but from the research that I've done, which has been fairly significant, I think that there's a strong case that can and should be made. So I will stop now and I guess turn it over to Professor Kantorovich or to questions. David, however you want to handle it.
Thank you, Mr. Fredman, for that comprehensive, fascinating, and I would add useful briefing. We will take questions from the audience of our participants after Professor Kantorovich's briefing. I mention again, you can post your questions in the chat function. Professor Kantorovich, thank you for joining us. I've already given you a lengthy introduction. People on this call are aware of your international legal credentials, so I'm going to turn the conversation over to you right away. Thank you. We need to unmute Professor Kantorovich. Go ahead.
Okay, great. And what would you like me to focus on?
We're going to focus with you on the civilian suffering and the laws of war.
Okay, so it's quite clear that in a war like this, there will be civilian suffering. And it's a tragedy. That's why international law makes starting a war, as Hamas did, illegal. But at the same time, international law says that every country has an inherent right of self-defense, and that's Article 51 of the UN Charter. This right is fundamental. A country has a right to protect itself. So when Israel goes to war, it is doing so lawfully, and it is doing so in compliance with the laws of war. What do the laws of war say? The fundamental principle of the law of war is the principle of distinction. Distinction means you need to distinguish between your combatants, your fighters, and your civilians. This is not something that obviously makes sense for an army, right? By putting on a uniform, by clearly distinguishing yourself, you're putting a big kill me sign on you, right? But that is what the law of war says, that to minimize civilian casualties, a military must put on distinctive uniforms and operate separately and apart to the extent that they can from civilian facilities. Hamas does the opposite of that. They embed themselves in civilian facilities. For example, one of their operational headquarters is said to be under the largest hospital in Gaza City, in the basement. Instead, what Israel does is it puts the nurseries and operation rooms of the hospital in the basement so they can resist bombs. Hamas puts Hamas in the basement. So Hamas violates that principle. What does that mean for Israel? What does that mean for Israel? Under the additional protocols of the Geneva Convention and commentary by the International Red Cross make clear that the presence of civilians at a legitimate military target does not immunize that target from attack. The presence of civilians, otherwise, it would be a reward for breaking the laws of war. Right? For not, it would incentivize parties to not abide by the Geneva Conventions and provide an incentive to co-locate with civilians. So what is the responsibility of a country to minimize civilian casualties? First of all, the principle of distinction, you can only strike military targets. So every target that Israel strikes has to have some military advantage, has to be somewhat military in nature, which does not just mean actual Hamas operatives, it could also mean infrastructure and other support that they use. But once one is striking a military target, it is not the case that one can only strike a military target if it results in 0 civilian deaths. Because in many warfare situations, that would almost be impossible. For example, the US-led campaign to eliminate ISIS in Syria and Iraq killed maybe 10,000 civilians. Obviously, World War II killed hundreds of thousands, millions of civilians, the Allied bombing campaigns. It's impossible to fight a war without civilian casualties. So the rule is you need to attack a target that is a valid military target, and that civilian casualties be proportionate to the anticipated military advantage. So what that means is, this is what's called the rule of proportionality. And it governs what's often called collateral damage, civilian casualties, what's called incidental casualties in the law of war, casualties that are not the goal of the strike. What this means is, if there is a sniper in a civilian building, one can shell that sniper's location, but one can't necessarily bomb the entire block. But Israel's not trying to get rid of a sniper or a squad of Hamas. Right? Israel's legitimate war aim is to destroy Hamas. And that is a very significant military objective. I would say the military objective can be defined as Israel's survival. Right? This is not like many wars that the United States, for example, fights, where the principal goal of each operation is to ensure the success of that operation, to allow the army freedom to maneuver, for example. But we now see that 1,000 Hamas fighters can commit a little genocide inside Israel, can essentially make areas of Israel, sovereign Israel, unlivable for Jews. So that means getting rid of 1,000 Hamas fighters becomes a vastly paramount military objective, which would warrant potentially significant collateral civilian casualties if necessary. Now, at the same time, just because you sort of can have civilian casualties doesn't mean you're not obligated to take steps to avoid them if possible. That's called the rule of precaution. Right? If there's reasonable precautions you can take that would lower the civilian casualties, one is obligated to do so. And that is why Israel is telling Gazans, get out. Israel is actually telling the enemy its battle plan. Here is where we're going to attack. Here's where we're going to invade. Here's where we're going to go after you. Eliminating the element of surprise, putting its soldiers in risk simply to save civilian lives. And the irony is that when Israel complies in the highest possible way with the law of war, by warning civilians, giving them plenty of time to leave, What do Israel's critics say? You're violating international law. You're not allowed to encourage them to leave. Now they're not being encouraged to leave. They're being told they have a choice. Hamas, on the other hand, is committing a war crime by prohibiting people who wish to seek shelter and refuge from fleeing. Egypt is violating international refugee law by illegally turning back refugees at the border and not giving them refuge. Israel, of course, evacuated its own civilians from the conflict zone, evacuating towns in the south and north to minimize its civilian casualties. Hamas is doing the opposite and trying to keep its civilians bottled up, which means Hamas bears all the responsibility for the any ensuing loss of life. The law of war is not a suicide pact. A country is not required to choose between being butchered and violating the law of war. The law of war allows for real self-defense. Otherwise, the United States would not have been able to fight World War II or any war up through the campaign against ISIS, and it's impossible to make it antiseptic. This is, the opprobrium rests solely on Hamas and on Egypt. Now, let me say another thing about a particular tactic Israel is using, the tactic of siege. So Israel has announced that it is besieging Gaza, which means closing entry and exit. Siege is, according to the US Defense Department military manual, a lawful, common, and regular mode of warfare. That's what one does in war. One tries to cut off the enemy from supplies. Now, again, the legitimate goal of a siege can even be to starve the enemy here defined as Hamas. So Israel is under no obligation, and Israel is allowed to take every step to ensure that not one morsel of food or water or electricity gets to Hamas. Now, it's true that this will also mean that civilians will not have access to those facilities, utilities. And again, the rule is proportionality. Now, it turns out Gaza does not need water from Israel. Gaza gets most of its water internally. Gaza can grow its own food. And certainly there's no precedent in international law for a country to be required to affirmatively provide utilities to its enemy, right? And that's what people don't understand. When they say Israel's cutting electricity to Gaza, it's not that Israel's blowing up the power stations, the generators, so that they don't have any electricity. Israel doesn't care if they have electricity or not, right? It's not like trying to get rid of the electricity so people are in the dark. Israel is not blowing up their water lines and their desalinization plants, though Hamas, by the way, tore up the water lines several years ago to use the pipes for missile launchers and made a video bragging about it. So it's not the case that Israel is engaging in a starvation strategy, because it's not trying to deprive the enemy of food or electricity. All that Israel did is said, you can have electricity and you can have water, but we don't have to actually give it to you from the Israeli water company and the Israeli utility company. And certainly there's no precedent in international law for requiring that. So the notion that any of these things are war crimes is ludicrous. And I would point out that in recent days, several professors of the law of war at West Point have written that Israel's actions are ordinary, that the criticisms of groups like Amnesty International are simply hard to understand, and that if the United States had to live by these rules, it would be impossible. Clearly, the best way to minimize civilian suffering is a rapid end to the conflict, means rapid victory, and the opening of the border by Egypt, which is an imperative. Look around the Middle East. Right? There have been many conflicts, unfortunately, throughout the Middle East. ISIS, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all those conflicts have generated millions of refugees. Those refugees have been allowed to flee. Right? Millions of people fled the Syrian civil war. Iraq, those refugees were allowed to go into Europe. Imagine if all the people who fled Syria were forced to stay in that conflict. The death toll would be vastly higher. That is why Europe let them in. Europe believes there is an obligation to take in refugees. But for Egypt, No, it's okay to actually push them back and to use their own Arab brothers as limitations on Israel's freedom to maneuver. And nothing like this has been seen in international conflict. Even, for example, just a few weeks ago, in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, 120,000 people fled to Armenia. Nobody said it was a war crime. Any further questions? Or that I think that covers the overview of the issues.
So thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Professor Kantorovich, for that nitty-gritty but important to understand overview of international law and how it applies to the current Gaza-Israel conflict, or should I say the Hamas war with Israel. We have a number of questions that have come in to both of you, Mr. Friedman and Professor Kantorovich. I would say the most general of the questions is the concern that everybody has, looking beyond this skirmish or this war, whether it lasts 2 weeks, 2 months, or 6 months. The question is, what happens to Gaza and its civilians after the war? What happens to the prism or the paradigm known as the two-state solution that has been advanced by so much of the global community for several decades now? Might Israel not be entering into an even stickier political situation in the wake of its war against Hamas? Mr. Friedman, you want to take that first?
Sure, absolutely. There's no doubt that this is going to be a complex war and a complex post-war situation. And if we recall, for example, at the height of the Second Intifada, when over 1,000 Israelis were murdered by suicide bombers, and Israel at the end went out to extensive military operation in the West Bank, retaking many of the PA cities. It's true that terror was pushed back to a degree by that operation, but really was defeated because Israel stayed there and Israel continued to fight terror and eventually was able to stop or greatly reduce the wave of terror. I've been making the argument also to many friends of mine in the Middle East that destroying Hamas is not just an Israeli interest, it is a Palestinian interest, it is a Arab interest as well. Again, because of these larger, I would say, ideological debate raging as we speak in the Middle East between the extremists and the moderates, because of the fact that Hamas is able to essentially put the brakes on processes of regional cooperation integration that will have great benefit for people across the region in terms of health and prosperity and sustainability, and for the Palestinians as well. I mean, it's becoming very, very clear, 100% clear after the latest attacks, that no Israeli government, not even the most left-wing Israeli government, is ever going to agree to the establishment of any kind of autonomous Palestinian entity while the possibility exists for Hamas to be destroyed. Now, when we say Hamas being destroyed, and we're talking about, a regional battle or an ideological battle as well, it has to be a victory not just on the West terms, but on Hamas's terms as well. And that was part of the intelligence failure or the military failure, was looking at Hamas like a rational Western actor. It has economic interests, it has political interests. It's not going to attack because, if we give it a little bit more money, we give it a little bit more work permits. And Hamas blew that paradigm in the face. So Israel's victory, as difficult and as complicated and complex as it's going to be, and to be frank, as uncertain as the next steps are going to be, will have to include not only defeating Hamas, but having Hamas and all of its ideological allies from the Muslim Brotherhood to Iran and to Iran's proxies understand that Hamas has truly been defeated and that Hamas's approach and ideology has been defeated and has only brought destruction on themselves and on the Palestinians.
Yeah, I agree with you, Asher. In recent days, I've received messages from friends abroad warning me that Israel is about to repeat the mistakes that America made in Afghanistan and Iraq. Israel's walking into a trap, they say. There's no quick fix. We need an end game. We need a vision for Gaza the morning after. And they may be right, but they ignore Israel's most urgent need, which is the immediate restoration of our shattered deterrence. We cannot survive, Israel will not survive in the Middle East unless our enemies fear us. And there's no time in Israeli history, except perhaps the first catastrophic days of the Yom Kippur War, where Israel's military credibility has been so undermined. And Hamas's blow is devastating precisely because it was the weakest of our enemies, and because the Israeli army failed miserably. And therefore, to lose our deterrent ability is to invite aggression on our borders, on all our borders. And therefore, we can have a discussion about what comes next. But first and foremost, this is a war against the Iranian axis. It's a war to restore Israel's military power and to prevent a situation in which Jews can be slaughtered in their living rooms. Professor Kontorovich, you want to take a crack at that as well?
I have a vision. I have a vision for what the future of Gaza would entail. This is assuming a successful military operation that would remove Hamas as the government. It's important. What a minimal requirement for Israel is ensuring that something like this can never happen again. This was the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, and truly genocidal in its brutality and its scale. Israel cannot continue as a country if it is put at risk, if people have to accept a catastrophe like this, a butchery like this, every 20 years, once a generation. That is not a sacrifice a country can be expected to make. And we have seen that there is only one circumstance in which Israel is not subject to intense attacks from Gaza, and that is Israeli administration. Before Israel left Gaza in 2005, things like this did not happen. And why are they not happening from Judea and Samaria, the West Bank? Because Israel is in control. And the comparison of those two areas really reveals that the presence of Israeli control, the presence of Israeli troops, is essential to maintaining Israeli security. No international force can do it. Recall, when Israel left Gaza, European contingent of monitors was put into the border corridor along Egypt, the Rafah corridor, to ensure that things were not smuggled in. As soon as some militants came and threatened them, they ran away. So Israeli control is necessary. That's one point. Secondly, there needs to be a denazification process. When the United States beat Germany, how did it rebuild Germany into the liberal democracy it is now? Because America understood that it was in a particular situation. Nazi Germany was a government that was originally elected, and that, even though it was authoritarian and not undemocratic, had broad support amongst the public. Hamas has broad support among the public. Whether it would win democratic elections doesn't matter. It has broad, substantial support in the public, and we can see this from the scenes of the abused and tortured prisoners, and not even one little old grandmother saying, guys, knock it out. Hamas has broad support, and that requires a significant process to fully weed out all of those supporters, right? Not just the actual Hamas militants, but a denazification process. And finally, and this is following what you were saying, Mr. Weinberg, there needs to be clear loss, right? They need to know they lost in a way that is meaningful and permanent. So Germany knew they lost after World War II. There was a price to be paid. Now, the people individually responsible for Nazi crimes were tried, and the people responsible for Hamas crimes should be tried also. But Germany also paid a price in the loss of some territory. And this is the price that will show that Hamas lost. What is Hamas trying to do? Force Jews out of the area. What does loss mean? The opposite. So Israel must create a defensive buffer zone, which it annexes on the precedent of the Golan Heights, which has vastly improved our security situation with Syria. And there's a basic doctrine in international law. You're not allowed to attack a country to take territory. You cannot start a war for the goal of taking territory. But Israel clearly is not in this war to take territory. Israel is in this war to save itself from genocide. But the only permanent way to ensure that could be territorial change, as happened with Syria in 1967 and as happened with Nazi Germany in 1945, where its borders were modified by the victorious Allies as a permanent reminder of their defeat.
Thank you. In the 10 minutes we have left for this conversation, I'd like to relate, at the request of our listeners, to two additional matters. One is Iran's role in all this. It's hard to shake the feeling that Iran is implementing a systematic plan against Israel, characterized by recurrent cycles of conflict and military engagements designed to erode Israeli society over time. In each cycle, each time Israel confronts increasingly intricate threats and a more adept adversary, and the linkages between the various geographical theaters, Hamas in the south, Hezbollah in the north, the linkage between these theaters of conflict seem to grow stronger, and for that reason alone, eliminating Hamas in Gaza is a necessity. The question is, of course, how directly does Israel push back against Iran now? Might this be the opportunity to strike a long-awaited and more significant blow at Iran? That's question one. Second question relates to Palestinian refugees. King Abdullah of Jordan issued a warning today that neither his country nor Egypt will accept any Palestinian refugees. He called it a red line. And I know there have been efforts in Washington and in other capitals to encourage President Sisi of Egypt to open the Gaza-Egypt border. But thus far, I think these efforts have come to naught. Where do you see things moving on this matter as well? Asher, you want to go first?
Sure. Tomorrow, UN sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile program, its sale of drones, will be removed tomorrow. Iran not only is one of the main sponsors of atrocities in Ukraine, obviously atrocities at home, but is now the sponsor of not just calling for the death to the Jews, to death to Israel, not just belittling or denying or distorting the Holocaust, but has now been the sponsor of, or one of the sponsors of one of the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Now, I don't want to, in terms of military planning, should there be a strike now? Should there be a strike later? Hezbollah, Iran, I think that's a military question that military experts should address. But in terms of the sanctions are up tomorrow. Any of the members of the Security Council could have, any members of the Iran deal could have implemented the snapback of all the sanctions, including those that have already been removed of Iran, and none of them did. So obviously here there is a moral duty to use every instrument of international pressure and every instrument of international sanctions, which we know work, including the use of Chinese entities to sell Iranian oil and to move funds, including various crypto exchanges, some of which are Russian, some of which are actually in GCC countries, that should be shut down. And in this case, also the countries of the GCC, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have suffered more than 1,000 missile and drone attacks from the Iranian-sponsored Houthis, including against airports, oil facilities, and civilians have died. And in this case, I think that there will be strong support for the defeat of Iranian's proxies, and in the long run, for steps against the head of the snake, against Iran itself. In one sense, regarding the refugees, whatever the refugees now currently are trying to disengage from Hamas. They understand that Israel intends to attack Hamas. They do not want to be used as human shields by Hamas. The idea, again, whatever the long-term solution for these refugees are, in Gaza or anywhere else might be, the idea that Arab countries, which never miss an opportunity to express their solidarity and their support for the Palestinian people, are now physically preventing them from not being used as human shields, essentially forcing them to be used as human shields for Hamas, is quite unbelievable, and also should be an issue raised by the many Western countries that have a very significant amount of leverage over countries like Egypt and Jordan.
Thank you. Professor Kontorovich?
Yeah, like Asher, I can't comment on sort of the wisdom militarily or how Iran should be dealt with. But it's clear that talking about this Hamas, we overuse the word Hamas. I think it is better to say Iran's local proxy militia in Gaza, Hamas, Iran's local proxy militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah. And it's clear that this entire thing, the simultaneous, the massacre in the south, the heating up of the northern border, the attacks by Hezbollah, it is a coordinated attempt by Iran. They picked this time to try to, because they were afraid of the rapprochement between Israel and the Arab world, and they want to, create a military conflict between Israel and Arab countries to push off that rapprochement, which is obviously the opposite of which is bad for their interests. And in Iran, following the logic and the methods by which they've destroyed Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen, are willing to fight what they call the Zionists. They're willing to fight the Zionists to the last Arab, right? I think that's also important to point out, right? Iran is using Arabs as their tools, their pawns, as they sit back and enjoy watching this. Any solution requires dealing with Iran. That's clear, right? Even if Hamas is beaten, Iran will find a new militia. So the head of the snake does need to be dealt with. If not now, then very soon. As for the refugees, Egypt and Jordan the things they say are clear violations of international law. They show disgusting contempt for the Palestinians. 1948, after the Israeli War of Independence, Israel took in 800,000 refugees from Arab countries, Jews from Arab countries. And Egypt and Jordan is saying not one Palestinian. Right? Do they not like the Palestinians? Do they see them as a liability? It's a clear violation of their international obligations. Egypt gets $3 billion a year in support from the United States, and certainly one would expect more from an ally like that.
Thank you. This brings our 1 hour live broadcast to a close. Once again, this has been an exclusive briefing for friends and followers of the Miskov Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy, brought to you live from Jerusalem. We've had the honor of hearing from Mr. Asher Fredman and Professor Eugene Kontorovich on two difficult and important issues relating to Israel's war with Gaza. Please follow the Miskov Institute on our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, and we have a WhatsApp community as well. There will be additional briefings of this type in the coming days, and certainly as this war proceeds over the coming weeks. Wishing everyone safety, security, and stamina until victory from Jerusalem.